Hey, you're back. Welcome to Season 2 of The People We Meet. My name is Bruner, and I'll be your host. This is a show about ordinary people that have done extraordinary things. I'm glad you're here, and let's get on with it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The People We Meet. The other night, I was doing something I probably shouldn't do, and that's check my podcast statistics. You know how it is. You put something out into the world, and you wonder who's actually listening. Is it just your friends, a few loyal regulars, or somebody's mom who left it playing by accident? And then I saw something that made me smile. Hong Kong. Not once, not a fluke click. An actual listenership. Now, I don't mind telling you, that surprised the hell out of me. So if you're listening in Hong Kong right now, let me say something clearly. Thank you. Truly, I am honored that you invited me into your home, or your car, or your AirPods, all the way across the world. Because that means that this little project, this attempt to bring people together through stories, somehow crossed an ocean. And that's not nothing. To me, it's kind of a big deal. And it took me back. I was there once in Hong Kong in 1989, a proud member of the 11th Marine Expeditionary Force aboard the intrepid USS Tarawa, before the handover, before the flags changed, and before history shifted its weight. I remember my first glimpse of that harbor as we sat at anchor. It looked exotic, beautiful, and completely foreign, with the star ferries sliding across the water and the little junks and the sampans that looked like they dotted the water from one end to the other. And I remember taking the Peak tram up to Victoria Peak, that steep climb that feels like the city is falling away beneath you. You step out at the top and suddenly there it is, the harbor, spread out like something engineered by God in steel, skyscrapers stabbing into the sky and the water reflecting it all back. It was one of those moments where you just stand there and think, man, the world is bigger than I thought. So when I saw Hong Kong pop up in my podcast stats, that skyline flashed into my mind, that harbor, that cool feeling that I haven't visited in way too long. And one name followed right behind it, Bruce Lee. If you say Hong Kong to a kid who grew up in the late 70s and 80s in America, chances are that name is going to surface pretty quick. And for me, it wasn't just a name. It was an icon, a force, a myth wrapped in muscle and philosophy. But here's the thing. Bruce Lee wasn't just a martial artist. He wasn't just a movie star. He wasn't just a guy who could throw a punch faster than the camera could catch. Because you see, there's kid Bruce Lee, and then there's adult Bruce Lee. The kid Bruce Lee, well, we'll talk about him in just a minute. And adult Bruce Lee, we'll talk about him a whole lot more after that. He was something else. He was a bridge between East and West, between tradition and innovation, between philosophy and action, between cultures that, even now, sometimes struggle to understand one another. And in a time when it feels like we're all retreating into a smaller and smaller corner, politically, culturally, digitally, I can't think of a better voice of the past to revisit, because this show, at its core, has always been about connection and finding the threads that tie us together instead of the walls that divide us. So to my listeners in Hong Kong, this one's for you. And to everyone else, this is a story about a man who refused to fit inside a single box. Let's talk about Bruce Lee. So there, like I said, there was kid Bruce Lee, and kid Bruce Lee was untouchable. Before I knew anything about philosophy, before I understood cultural barriers or Hollywood politics or identity, there was just this guy on a screen who moved like something from another planet. In our neighborhood, Bruce Lee wasn't a movie star. He was a frickin' law. We built nunchucks in the garage like they were sacred tools. Broom handles, little pieces of chain, electrical tape, whatever we could get our grubby little hands on. Garage door down, concrete floor, dust in the air. And there we were, convinced that if we just trained hard enough, fast enough, loud enough, we might tap into whatever it was that he had. Nunchucks. My first little pair was a set of green plastic tubes filled with rolled up newspaper to give them some heft, and the connector was a small piece of my neighbor's sister's jump rope, which she was none too pleased about. You see, you had to work up to the wood nunchucks, because you don't practice nunchucks in the garage without taking a few upside the head. And I took several upside the head, which, come to think of it, might explain a few things. We watched his movies like they were gospel. Enter the Dragon wasn't just a film, it was instruction. Fist of Fury wasn't entertainment, it was doctrine. And here's the thing, nobody debated Bruce Lee. Not seriously. There were no who would win arguments. Nobody asked whether Sugar Ray Leonard or Roberto Duran could take him. Nobody brought up heavyweight boxers. Nobody compared him to NFL linebackers or street fighters or whoever the tough guy of the week happened to be. The answer was obvious. It's Bruce Lee. It's always Bruce Lee. Even Chuck Norris, and this is important, even Chuck Norris got handled. And Chuck was American. And that should have meant something to a bunch of red-blooded kids growing up in the 80s. But it didn't. We weren't mad. We weren't conflicted. And we weren't running geopolitical calculations in our head. We just knew what we were seeing. And what we were seeing was the best. No comparison. And here's how deep it went. We mimicked him constantly. The stance, the hand gestures, the sounds, the glare. But no one, and I mean no one, ever said, "I'm Bruce Lee," because that would have been absurd, preposterous, borderline disrespectful. You could pretend to be Superman. You could pretend to be Rambo. You could even pretend to be Chuck Norris. But Bruce Lee, that wasn't cosplay. That was sacred ground. There was a sense, even as kids, that he operated on a level that didn't belong to the rest of us. Not because he was fictional, but because he was real. Real and unreachable. And then there were the myths. The rumors that he wasn't really gone, that he'd faked his death, that he'd come back someday to prove he was still the best. And we half believed it. Shit, half of us still believed in Santa Claus. Because that's what legends do. They refuse to stay dead. As kids, we didn't know the biography. We didn't know about San Francisco, Hong Kong, or discrimination, or studio executives telling him he wasn't marketable enough to lead. We just knew this. If Bruce Lee walked into the room, everything changed. And that kind of power, the kind that crosses oceans and cultures and decades, it doesn't happen by accident. Kid Bruce Lee was invincible. And adult Bruce Lee, he's even more interesting. Now, if Bruce Lee was sitting across from me in this studio, the first question I would ask would be the same one I ask every guest who walks through the door. Where were you born? And the answer might surprise some people. Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco, California in 1940. Not Hong Kong, San Fran. And his father, Lee Hoi Chuen, was a Cantonese opera performer who happened to be touring with the United States at the time. And his mom, Grace Ho, came from a prominent Hong Kong family with both Chinese and Eurasian heritage. From the very beginning, Bruce Lee existed between worlds, American by birth, Chinese by upbringing. And that small detail, being born in America, mattered more than anyone could have guessed at the time, because it meant Bruce Lee was an American citizen, something that would quietly shape the course of his life years later. But Bruce didn't grow up in California. When he was still an infant, his family returned to Hong Kong, where he would spend most of his childhood. And the Hong Kong that Bruce Lee grew up in wasn't the polished skyline that people see today. It was crowded, intense, still recovering from war. British colonial rule mixed with deep Chinese traditions. East and West constantly brushing up against each other. In other words, it was a city that lived in the same in-between space Bruce himself would occupy for the rest of his life. And that in-between status wasn't just cultural, it was political. Hong Kong had been under British rule since the 19th century when China lost the Opium Wars and was forced to cede territory to Britain. Over time, that control expanded, and by 1898, Britain secured a 99-year lease on the new territories, effectively placing the whole region under British administration. Now, the lease meant something important. It had an expiration date, and in 1997, Hong Kong would return to Chinese sovereignty under an agreement known as the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which promised that Hong Kong's unique economic and legal systems would remain unchanged for 50 years under the principle of one country, two systems. So the Hong Kong that Bruce Lee grew up in was a place living in a strange historical balance, unmistakably Chinese, governed by Britain, and already carrying the long shadow of a future that hadn't arrived yet. As a kid, Bruce Lee was energetic. He was restless and already drawn towards performance. Acting ran in the family, and he began appearing in films at a young age. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had already appeared in more than 20 movies as a child actor in Hong Kong. But acting wasn't the thing that had defined him yet. Fighting was. And Bruce got into a lot of fights. Real fights, street fights, rooftop fights with rival neighborhood groups. Not the choreographed cinematic battles we grew up watching on screen. These were scrappy teenage confrontations that worried his parents enough that they began to fear where things were heading. So when Bruce turned 18, his family made a decision, and they shipped him back to the United States, back to the country where he had been born but barely knew. He arrived in America with very little money, a restless personality, and a life that could have gone in a dozen different directions. And one of the places he landed was Seattle. And this is one of those moments in Bruce Lee's story that people often overlook. Because before the movie star, before the legend, Bruce Lee was a college student. He enrolled at the University of Washington, where he studied philosophy. Not martial arts, not acting, philosophy. And that detail matters because the man who would later become famous for his speed and fighting ability was also deeply interested in ideas. He read constantly. He studied Eastern and Western philosophy. He thought about identity, discipline, and the nature of human potential. But Bruce wasn't just studying ideas. He was also starting to imagine what he might do with them. He believed martial arts could be more than a private discipline practiced in small schools and hidden behind tradition. He believed it could be shared with the world through teaching, through writing, and maybe even through film. Now, at the time, the idea sounded almost ridiculous. And Hollywood certainly wasn't looking for a Chinese-American martial artist to carry a story. But Bruce had never been particularly interested in waiting for the world to decide what was possible. And while he was studying, he also began teaching martial arts. At the time, traditional Chinese martial arts were usually taught only to Chinese students. It was an old cultural rule that many instructors took pretty seriously. But Bruce ignored it. He taught anyone who wanted to learn. Black students, crackers, anyone willing to train and work hard. Skill mattered, commitment mattered, and race didn't. That decision upset some traditional martial artists who believed Bruce was violating an important cultural boundary. But Bruce had already started to form the philosophy that would guide the rest of his life. He wasn't interested in preserving traditions simply because it was old. He was interested in what worked. He believed martial arts, like life, should evolve, adapt, improve, take the best ideas from wherever they came from, and leave behind what no longer served a purpose. Years later, he would summarize that philosophy in a line that would become one of his most famous. Absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, add what is uniquely your own. But at the time, Bruce was simply a young man in Seattle trying to figure out who he was. And in a strange way, that uncertainty would become one of his greatest strengths. Because Bruce Lee didn't quite belong to just one world. He was born in America, raised in Hong Kong, and studying philosophy in Seattle, moving between cultures, languages, and expectations. And for a guy who seemed to have been so many places, he felt, at times, like he belonged to nowhere. But that same position, standing between two worlds, eventually allowed him to build a bridge to everywhere. The young man trying to figure himself out in Seattle didn't stay unknown for very long. Bruce Lee had a way of attracting attention. Part of it was the speed. People who saw him demonstrate techniques often said the same thing. It didn't look real. Movements that were supposed to happen in fractions of a second happened faster than the eye expected. But the thing that really caught people's attention was something else: confidence. Bruce Lee carried himself with a kind of quiet certainty that made people lean forward when he spoke. When he demonstrated martial arts, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like you were watching someone who understood something the rest of the room hadn't quite figured out yet. And in 1964, Bruce Lee stepped onto a stage at the Long Beach International Karate Championships in California. And if you were a martial arts enthusiast in America at the time, this was the place to be. Fighters, instructors, and martial artists from all over the country gathered there to demonstrate their techniques. Bruce wasn't there to compete. He was there to demonstrate. And within minutes, people realized that they were watching something a little bit different. He showed off what would later become famous as the 1-inch punch, a strike delivered from almost no distance that could send a man stumbling backward across the floor. He demonstrated lightning-fast hand combinations that seemed to land before observers even realized the movement had begun. People in the audience didn't just watch. They stared. And among the people paying attention that day were individuals connected to Hollywood. One of them was Jay Sebring, a well-known hairstylist whose client list included some of the biggest stars in the entertainment industry. Sebring was fascinated by what he saw and began talking about Bruce Lee to people in television and films. Before long, Bruce was invited to audition for television roles. And that's how he landed the part that would introduce him to American audiences, a character named Kato. The show was called The Green Hornet. Now here's the funny thing. The show itself only ran for a single season in the United States. But the moment Bruce Lee appeared on screen, audiences noticed him immediately. Kato moved differently. He fought differently. Every scene he appeared in seemed to crackle with a kind of energy that the rest of the show couldn't quite match. And while the series didn't last long in America, something unexpected happened overseas. In Hong Kong, audiences absolutely loved it. In fact, the show became so closely associated with Bruce Lee that in some places it was nicknamed The Kato Show. Suddenly, Bruce Lee, the young man who'd grown up in Hong Kong and later struggled to find his place in America, was becoming a familiar face on television screens around the world. But fame didn't solve everything. And here's something that says a lot about the time Bruce Lee was living in. Even though audiences immediately noticed him, even though many people felt that the Kato character was the most exciting thing on the show, Bruce wasn't treated like a star behind the scenes, and his pay reflected that. Van Williams, the dude who played the Green Hornet, he earned roughly $2,000 an episode. The rest of the cast members were somewhere between $800 and $900 an episode. And Bruce, he earned $450. The man delivering some of the most electrifying moments on television was being paid a fraction of what the lead actor received. And Bruce knew it. And he knew something else, that this was a door. And sometimes the first door that opens isn't the one you ultimately walk through. Sometimes it's just the one that proves you belong in the building. Because even as audiences responded to him, the American film and television industry still struggled with a question that said more about the times than it did about Bruce Lee. What exactly do you do with an Asian leading man? Hollywood, at the time, had a habit of casting Asian characters in narrow, stereotypical roles. Villains, sidekicks, mysterious outsiders. Bruce Lee understood very quickly that if he wanted to succeed, he would have to navigate an industry that didn't quite know where he fit. And Bruce Lee had never been very comfortable fitting into boxes that other people built. So even as his reputation grew, he began to face a frustrating reality. He was good enough to impress everyone who saw him, but not everyone was ready to fully appreciate what they were seeing. And that tension between what Bruce Lee knew he could become and what the world was prepared to give him was about to shape the next chapter of his life. Now, Bruce believed he could lead, not just in martial arts demonstrations, not just in supporting a role on television. He believed he could carry a story. And the more people watched him, the more they saw his speed, his presence, the way he seemed to command a room without even trying, the more obvious that seemed. So Bruce Lee did something that not many young actors at the time had the confidence to do. He began developing ideas of his own. And one of them was a television concept about a wandering martial artist traveling through the American West, a quiet fighter, thoughtful, philosophical, a man moving from town to town, helping people who needed it and confronting injustice when he found it. Bruce believed in the idea deeply, and he pitched it. Now, depending on who you talk to all these years later, there are different versions of what happened next. Some people inside the television industry later claimed Bruce Lee had never formally pitched the concept the way he remembered it. Others who knew him were absolutely certain that he had. But here's what we know for sure. Not long after those conversations took place, a television show appeared that looked awfully familiar. It was called Kung Fu. The story centered on a wandering Shaolin monk traveling across the American frontier, solving problems with both wisdom and martial arts skill. And the lead role, the role Bruce Lee believed he helped create, was played by David Carradine. And for Bruce Lee, that moment cut deep. He had already spent years pushing against the limits Hollywood seemed determined to place around him. He knew he could do more than play the sidekick. He knew he could carry a story. And suddenly, there it was, the story he believed in, told without him. Friends later said the experience hurt him more than he let on publicly. Bruce Lee wasn't someone who spent a lot of time bitching about the system. He preferred to outwork it. But that moment confirmed something he had already started to suspect. Hollywood was not ready for him. Not yet. And if Bruce waited patiently for the industry to change, we might never be talking about him today. Because Bruce Lee wasn't built to sit around waiting for permission. So instead, he did what he had done his entire life when a path closed in front of him. He found another one. And that path led back across the Pacific, back to Hong Kong. Now, you might imagine that returning home would have been a triumphant moment, the prodigal son coming back from America to a hero's welcome. But the reality was a little more complicated than that. Bruce had been gone for years. He had trained in America, taught in America, appeared on American television, and when he stepped back into Hong Kong's martial arts world, some people looked at him with a certain skepticism. To them, he was the guy coming back from the United States acting like he was an American big shot. And in the martial arts community, reputations weren't handed out politely. They were tested. But Bruce had never been afraid of that, because the city he returned to was about to give him something Hollywood hadn't, an opportunity. And once Bruce Lee stepped through that door, the rest of the world would soon follow. The opportunity Bruce Lee found in Hong Kong came from a studio called Golden Harvest. And at the time, Golden Harvest was a relatively new company trying to compete with the much larger Shaw Brothers studio that dominated the Hong Kong film industry. They were looking for something different, something that could shake up the formula. And Bruce was exactly that. In 1971, he signed a contract and began to work on a film called The Big Boss. And no one expected what was going to happen next. When the film hit theaters, audiences poured in. The movie shattered box office records in Hong Kong and across parts of Asia. People weren't just watching Bruce Lee fight. They were watching a kind of intensity that martial arts films hadn't really captured before. The speed was real, the impact felt real, and Bruce Lee wasn't playing the quiet background character anymore. He was the center of the storm. The next film, Fist of Fury, only made the phenomenon bigger. In that movie, Bruce played a Chinese martial artist confronting the humiliation and violence imposed by Japanese occupiers in early 20th century Shanghai. For many audiences, the film tapped into something deeper than entertainment. It became a symbol of pride. And Bruce Lee wasn't just a movie star now. He was a cultural force. But Bruce wasn't satisfied simply being the guy in front of the camera. He wanted control over the story itself. So in 1972, he wrote, directed, and starred in his next film, Way of the Dragon. And this is where one of those moments happened that kind of sticks in people's memories for decades. The final fight takes place inside the Roman Colosseum. Bruce Lee versus fucking Chuck Norris. No flashy editing, no music swelling in the background, just two fighters circling each other on ancient stone. And for people watching in the early 1970s, it felt like something entirely new. Martial arts films had existed before, but Bruce Lee was turning them onto something else, something raw, something physical, and something alive. And as those films spread beyond Hong Kong and across the world, the legend of Bruce Lee began to grow just as quickly as Kid Bruce Lee did in my head while practicing my nunchucks. Except now it wasn't a rumor in a neighborhood garage. It was real. And the world was only beginning to see what he could do. By the early 1970s, Bruce Lee was no longer just a rising star in Hong Kong. He was a phenomenon. His films were breaking box office records across Asia, and word was beginning to spread beyond the region. Audiences who had never seen martial arts presented this way before were suddenly paying attention. And eventually, Hollywood noticed too. And this time, the door didn't stay closed. Warner Brothers partnered with Golden Harvest to produce a film that would introduce Bruce Lee to a global audience. It would become the first major collaboration between Hollywood and the Hong Kong martial arts film industry. The movie was called Enter the Dragon. If Bruce Lee had been waiting for a chance to show the world what he could do, this was it. The film blended everything that made him unique: martial arts, philosophy, physical charisma, the quiet intensity that made every movement feel deliberate. But what people often forget is how much of Bruce Lee himself lived inside that film. Because behind the action scenes and the iconic one-liners was the philosophy he had been developing for years. Bruce Lee believed that strength wasn't just about force. It was about adaptability. One of his most famous lines captured that idea perfectly. "Be water, my friend. Water can flow, or it can crash. It can take the shape of whatever holds it." Bruce Lee believed people should live the same way: flexible, aware, constantly learning and adapting rather than locking themselves into rigid systems. It was a philosophy that extended far beyond martial arts. It was about life, about identity, about refusing to let the world decide who you were supposed to be. And when Enter the Dragon premiered in 1973, it did exactly what Bruce Lee had always believed he could do. It captured the world's attention, and the film became an international success and turned Bruce Lee into a global icon almost overnight. But there was a cruel twist to that success. Bruce Lee never saw the full impact of what he created. On July 20th, 1973, at the age of 32, Bruce Lee died suddenly in Hong Kong of a cerebral aneurysm. The news stunned fans across the world. A man who had seemed larger than life, faster than anyone, stronger than anyone, almost superhuman in his presence, was suddenly gone. And in a strange way, that loss only deepened the legend. Because Bruce Lee didn't just leave behind a handful of movies. He left behind an idea. The idea that a person could stand between cultures, between traditions, between expectations, and build something entirely new. And decades later, people are still listening to that voice. So for a long time, Bruce Lee lived in my mind the same way he probably lived in the minds of a lot of kids who grew up when I did. He was Kid Bruce Lee, the unstoppable fighter, the guy moving so fast the camera could barely keep up, the legend that we tried and failed to imitate in garages and backyards with homemade nunchucks and big imaginations. And then life moved on. Years passed. Other things filled the space. And Bruce Lee became one of those figures you remember fondly, but you don't think about very often anymore, until something reminds you. For me, it was a little blip on a podcast statistics page. Hong Kong. Somewhere across the Pacific Ocean, people were listening to this show, listening to the same stories we share here about connection and understanding and the strange way people's lives intersect. And that moment made me think of Bruce Lee again. Not Kid Bruce Lee, adult Bruce Lee. The man who spent his life standing between worlds. Born in America, raised in Hong Kong, studying philosophy in Seattle, building a career that bridged two film industries that barely understood each other at the time. For much of his life, Bruce Lee felt like he didn't completely belong anywhere. Too American for some people, too Chinese for others. And yet that exact position, standing between cultures, traditions, and expectations, is what allowed him to build something new. He became a bridge. And maybe that's why his words still feel relevant today. We live in a time where people are constantly being told which box they belong in, which side they're supposed to stand on, which identity they're supposed to adopt. And Bruce Lee rejected that idea entirely. Instead, he offered something simpler. Absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, add what is uniquely your own. In other words, think for yourself, adapt, grow, be water. And sometimes it takes a strange little moment to remind us of voices like that. And for me, it was seeing Hong Kong appear on that listener map. So to everyone listening out there, and everyone else around the world, thank you, because this episode exists because of you. Sometimes the voices of the past don't fade away. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right moment to speak again. And this time, the voice I needed to hear came from Hong Kong. And whether you're on the other side of the world or right here in my backyard, usually I'll say, party on. But today, I'll just say, be water, my friends. Thanks, Hong Kong. Thanks, Bruce. Well, that'll about do it for this episode of The People We Meet. But before we wrap up, I want to give a huge shout out to my main man, J-Mac, over at Studio 42 Recordings. I couldn't do this without you, brother. And much love to my family for their constant support. And most of all, thank you, the listeners. This show exists because you keep showing up, and I don't take that lightly. And if you like what you hear, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook. Give the show a follow and spread the word. And if you know someone with a story that just has to be told, or if that someone is you, drop me a line at thepeoplewemeetpodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and be good to each other.